The next function that we will graph is y is equal to -4 cosine of x over 3 minus 5. Now, as with any sine or cosine graph, the first thing that we need to do is identify our three pieces of information: our amplitude, our period, and our midline. So let's go ahead and start with our amplitude. Our amplitude we find by looking at the coefficient of our cosine function. Our coefficient's -4, but amplitude is always positive, so we would say our amplitude is 4. So we have a total distance of 8 if we went from our maximum to our minimum, because it's a total of 2 amplitudes. If we want to look at the period, or the amount of time it takes to get through one wave, we need to look at the coefficient of the x. The coefficient of the x in this case is 1/3. So if I want to find my period, I need to take the original period of cosine, which is 2 pi, and divide that by my b value, which is 1/3. And if I divide 2 pi by 1/3, I'm really saying 2 pi multiplied by the reciprocal, which is 3 over 1, which, if I simplify that further, would become 6 pi. Now, in order to find my midline, which is the last thing that I need to figure out, my midline is always the number that is adding or subtracting after my sine or cosine function. So in this case, that midline is going to be at -5. So that means our graph is going to be shifted down 5, so the center of the graph is at -5 instead of the traditional 0. So if I go ahead and draw my x and y axis, I'm going to want to come down a little bit further on my y-axis because I'm shifting it down. So if I'm shifting it down 5, I'm going to call this -5. I want to go even a little bit further. Now my amplitude of 4 says I'm 4 units away from my midline. So if I were to go 4 units down from my midline, that would put me at -9. If I were to go 4 units above, that would put me just below the x-axis at -1. So that represents my maximum of -1, my midline of -5, and my minimum value of -9. As with all the other sine and cosine graphs, we need to split this up into 4 equal sections to represent those 4 quadrants. And at the end of that fourth one, we're going to go ahead and put our period, which in this case was 6 pi. If I wanted to go half of the period, that'd be on the second line. So I could cut 6 pi in half. That would be 3 pi. If I wanted to cut that in half, that would give me my first one. And since 3 doesn't divide evenly by 2, I'm just going to write this as 3 pi halves to show that I'm dividing 3 by 2, but it doesn't go evenly. Now to find that third dash mark on the x-axis, I would need to multiply the first value of 3 pi halves by 3, because it's 3 equal distances to get there. And 3 pi over 2 multiplied by 3 gives me 9 pi over 2. So now I'm ready to graph my cosine function. And we know cosine functions either start at their maximum value or their minimum value. With this cosine having a negative coefficient, we are going to start at its minimum value. So we're going to start the graph down here at -9. By the time we hit our 3 pi halves, we've gone through a quarter of our period. We should be back to the midline, which is -5. By the time we hit 3 pi, we should have finished half of our wave, so we should be at the maximum. When we get to 9 pi halves, we will come back down to the midline. And by the time we complete our period, which was 6 pi, we should be back down to our minimum, right where we started at -9. So we alternate minimum value, middle of the graph, maximum value, middle of the graph, minimum value. And we could continue to do that over and over again for each of these sine and cosine functions.